They said the tiger could make grown men quiet, but this one never fired a shot in anger, and that was what made it strange, because fear usually comes from what has already happened, not from what might never happen at all. It sat at the edge of a pine forest where the road thinned into mud and then into nothing, its tracks half sunk, its engine cold so long that birds had begun to nest in the gaps of the armor. If you listened carefully, you could hear the forest breathe around it, leaves rubbing together like old paper, wind slipping past steel that had once been the loudest thing in the world. Somewhere far away, the war was burning itself out in noise and flame, but here the tiger waited as if it had been forgotten mid-aught. The men assigned to it arrived one by one, never together at first. They were told this was a reserve vehicle, a spare, something to be ready in case everything else failed. That word, reserve, sounded safe. It sounded like distance. It sounded like survival. No one asked why a machine so heavy, so expensive, so feared, had been pushed into a quiet corner of the map like an afterthought. The commander was the first to understand. He ran his hand along the armor plate and felt the roughness where factory paint had already begun to peel. This tank had been rushed out, he could tell, new but not loved, built by hands that knew the war was turning and worked faster than they once had. The tiger smelled of oil and cold iron, not of smoke. It had never been baptized by fire. Inside, the air was still, too still. A fighting compartment usually carried echoes of voices, curses, laughter forced too loud, memories trapped in metal. This one held nothing but the faint ticking of cooling steel and the soft scrape of boots on the floor. The seats were barely worn. The shells sat in their racks like questions that had never been asked. They trained with it in the mornings, slow drills, quiet commands. Start the engine, check the gauges, traverse the turret, stop. Always stop. The gunner learned the feel of the controls without ever seeing a target. The loader practiced lifting shells he would never feed into the breach. The driver memorized the weight of the tank the way a man memorizes a burden he suspects he will carry forever but never actually lift. Other crews passed by sometimes, heading forward, their tigers already scarred, already marked with chalk numbers and soot. Those men looked tired in a different way. They smelled like burned fuel and fear that had already found a shape. They would glance at the reserve tank and laugh, not kindly, not cruelly either, just the laughter of men who knew something the others did not. One of them said once, half under his breath, that a tiger that never fights is heavier than one that does. At night the forest pressed closer. The crew slept nearby, not inside. No one wanted to sleep inside a tank that had never learned what it was. The commander lay awake listening to distant artillery, counting seconds between flashes and sound, trying to guess how close the front really was. He wondered if the tiger could hear it too, if steel remembered why it had been shaped this way. Orders came and went. Move up, stand by, hold position. The tiger rolled a few kilometers, then stopped again. Each time the engine roared to life, it felt like a promise. Each time it shut down, it felt like an apology. The men stopped talking about when they would see combat, and started talking about when the war might end. That was when the silence grew dangerous, because hope can be louder than fear if you let it. Once, an aircraft passed overhead, low and fast. The gunner swung the turret on instinct, heart racing, breath caught in his throat. For a moment the tiger was alive, fully awake, ready to do what it had been built to do. Then the plane vanished and the gun settled back into its forward position like an animal lying down again. No one said anything. They all felt it, the strange relief mixed with shame. The commander began to think of the tiger as a story no one would tell. Other tanks would be remembered by the scars they carried, the battles they survived or failed to survive. This one would leave no mark on history, no crater, no burning wreck. It would exist only in paperwork, in a serial number stamped deep into its hull, in the memories of men who never got to prove whether they were brave or simply lucky. As the weeks passed, the paint faded, mud hardened, snow came and softened everything, turning the tank into a white shape among white trees. The war moved again, closer now, then farther away. Rumors said fuel was running out. Rumors said the factories were gone. Rumors said surrender was a word being spoken quietly in warm rooms far from the forest. One morning, The order finally arrived, not to advance, not to fight, but to abandon. Sabotage equipment if possible. Withdraw on foot. The crew stood around the tiger, hands in pockets, breath fogging the air. The commander placed the charges carefully, almost gently, the way one might tuck a blanket around a sleeping child. He hesitated longer than he should have. When they walked away, no one looked back. The explosion came later, muffled by distance and trees. The forest swallowed the sound quickly. By the time birds returned to the branches, the place where the tiger had waited was just another torn patch of earth, indistinguishable from so many others. Years later, people would talk about tigers as monsters, as legends, as unstoppable machines. They would count kills and quote armor thickness and argue over tactics. No one would mention the one that waited in the forest, the one no one played, the tiger that carried all the weight of war and never once released it. Time passed in the way it always does after noise stops, quietly, without asking permission. The forest healed faster than anyone would have believed. Grass pushed through the churned soil, moss crept over blackened roots, and rain softened the sharp edges of the scar left behind. If you stood there years later, you would feel nothing special, no echo, no warning. Only the wind moving through trees that had learned to stand again. But the tiger did not disappear completely. Steel has a memory longer than men. Fragments lay buried under the earth, twisted plates, bolts scorched and half, melted, pieces too heavy to bother removing. Farmers found them first, plowing shallow fields nearby, their blades striking something that rang instead of cracked. They would curse, dig a little, then leave it alone, as if the ground itself had asked to keep what it was holding. Children came later, boys mostly, curious in the way only those born after a war can be. They picked at rusted edges, traced numbers with their fingers, imagined stories far louder than the truth. To them, it was always a tank that fought heroically, that held a road that burned gloriously. No one ever guessed the harder story, the one where nothing happened, where waiting was the only action, where restraint became fate. Old men sometimes watched from a distance, men who had worn uniforms once, though not always the same ones. They recognized the shape even when it was broken. They knew the smell of old oil trapped in soil, the way iron changes the sound of footsteps. One of them might feel a tightness in his chest without knowing why, remembering a time when silence felt heavier than incoming fire. In books, the war settled into neat lines and dates. Tigers advanced here, tigers were destroyed there. The idea of a tiger that never fought did not fit well on a page. It raised uncomfortable questions. What does power mean if it is never used? What does fear become if it never finds release? What happens to men trained for violence when the moment never arrives? The crew scattered into ordinary lives. The driver worked in a repair shop, hands still steady, listening to engines that sounded nothing like the one he had memorized. The gunner avoided loud noises, not because they reminded him of battle, but because they reminded him of how close he once came to having a story worth fearing. The loader kept his strength, lifting crates in a warehouse, each motion echoing a task he had rehearsed hundreds of times for a moment that never came. The commander carried it differently. He spoke little about the war, not because of what he had seen, but because of what he had not. At night, he sometimes dreamed of the tiger starting up on its own, rolling forward through the trees, finally finding its place in the world. He would wake with his heart racing, then feel the strange relief of knowing that no one had died because of that machine, and the strange regret of knowing that it had been built for nothing else. History prefers motion. It prefers clashes and turning points, moments where something breaks so that something else can begin. The tiger that no one played with offered none of that. It stood as proof that not all weapons fulfill their purpose, that sometimes the most powerful thing a machine can do is remain unused, and sometimes the heaviest burden a soldier carries is the battle that never arrives. Even now, if you walk through forests like that one, you might pass places where the ground feels different underfoot, where trees grow just a little crooked, where birds go quiet for no clear reason. You would not see a tiger, you would not hear an engine, but you might feel the weight of something that once waited there, patient, silent, terrifying in its restraint, a reminder that war leaves marks not only where steel collides, but also where it never does. Sometimes the ground remembers longer than people do, long after maps were redrawn and borders hardened into something that looked permanent. That patch of forest carried a density to it, as if the air itself had learned to hesitate. Rain pooled there differently, snow lingered longer in the shade. Hunters noticed it without understanding, the way animals slowed when crossing an invisible line, ears tilting, steps cautious, as though something large might still be sleeping beneath the soil. A road was eventually cut nearby, narrow at first, then widened as trucks grew heavier and lives grew faster. The workers found more steel, bent track links, a shattered wheel hub, a slab of armor too thick for any ordinary machine. They argued about hauling it away, about scrap value, about effort versus reward. In the end, most of it stayed where it was. The machines complained when they tried to move it, engines straining, cables snapping. Someone joked that the tanks still didn't want to go anywhere. New generations grew up without knowing the word tiger meant anything other than an animal in a book. The war became something distant, flattened by documentaries and grainy footage, explained by calm voices that never mentioned how waiting could hollow a man out. In museums, tigers stood polished and complete, surrounded by lights and placards. Visitors admired them the way one admires a storm trapped in glass, impressive, contained, safely finished. But this one had no museum, no plaque, no careful restoration. Its story lived only in absence. In the fact that nothing dramatic had happened where something terrible easily could have. In the lives that unfolded elsewhere because a gun had never fired, because an order had never come in time to matter. The commander grew old. His hands trembled when he held a cup, the same hands that had once been steady enough to guide a machine designed to dominate a battlefield. When asked about the war, he spoke in generalities. Cold mud, waiting, people assumed he was avoiding painful memories. They did not realize he was circling a silence that felt too fragile to touch directly. Near the end, he returned to the forest once. He did not tell anyone why. He walked slowly, leaning on a stick, following instincts older than memory. The trees were taller now, the light different, but his feet stopped him in the right place. He stood there for a long time, listening. No engines, no voices, just wind and birds and the soft, ordinary sound of a world that had continued. He whispered something then, not an apology, not a goodbye, more like recognition, as if acknowledging that the tiger had done its job after all, not by destroying, but by never beginning. When he was gone, no one connected his death to that place. Life does not draw lines that neatly, yet the idea lingered, unspoken, that some stories are carried by fewer people than they deserve, and some machines shape history simply by remaining still. The Tiger tank no one played was not a failure of design or courage. It was a pause made of steel, a moment where potential violence stayed potential, a reminder that even in war, there are spaces where nothing happens, and that those spaces matter more than anyone ever thinks to record. After that, the place settled into anonymity again. No one marked it on a map. No one fenced it off or warned others away. It became one of those locations people pass without noticing, even when they are standing directly on it. A hollow between trees, a bend where the road straightens, a patch of ground that feels older than it should. Occasionally, someone would feel compelled to stop there for reasons they could not explain. A driver might pull over, engine idling, stare into the trees, then shake their head and continue on. A hiker might rest a little longer than planned, pack still on their shoulders, listening to nothing in particular. They would leave with a faint sense of unease or calm, never quite sure which one it was. The steel beneath the soil continued its slow conversation with time. Rust bloomed and flaked away, layer by layer, a patient undoing. Rainwater carried iron into the roots of trees, tinting leaves darker in late summer. Insects built homes in cavities that once held bolts and pins. Life adapted without ceremony, without judgment, using whatever remained. The idea of the unused tiger surfaced now and then among historians, usually as a footnote, usually dismissed, resources wasted, poor logistics, a symptom of a collapsing system. They spoke in clean language, the kind that keeps emotion at arm's length. None of them stayed long enough at the site to feel the weight of it, to understand that this was not just inefficiency, but restraint frozen in metal. There is a temptation to believe that only action defines meaning, that only explosions, victories, and losses deserve remembrance. But the tiger in the forest challenged that belief quietly. It suggested that history is also shaped by what does not happen, by decisions delayed, by weapons silenced before they speak. Some nights, when the wind moved just right, the trees creaked in a way that almost sounded mechanical. Not like an engine, not really, but enough to stir the imagination. Anyone hearing it might think of massive tracks biting into earth, of a turret turning slowly, of power waking from sleep. And then the sound would fade, leaving only leaves and branches, the illusion dissolving back into nothing. If the tiger had fought, it would have been destroyed or celebrated. Either way, it would have ended cleanly, its purpose fulfilled. Instead, it lingered in fragments and memory, unfinished, unresolved. That made it harder to carry, but also harder to forget. The war taught many lessons, most of them written in fire. This one was written in stillness. It said that not every monster needs to roar to leave a mark, that sometimes the most enduring presence is the one that never steps fully into the light. And so the forest kept its secret, and the ground held its weight, and the tiger remained what it had always been in that place, not a weapon, not a legend, but a quiet, heavy pause, waiting forever in the space between what was built to happen and what never did.